Then solve it. The words landed flat and cold, like a challenge already decided, and the chalk rolled across Elijah Brooks' desk before stopping near his wrist. A few students shifted in their seats, some pretending not to watch, others leaning in just enough to catch the moment they all knew was coming. Because Professor Daniel Whitmore didn't call on students to help them. He called on them to prove something, and most of the time, that something was failure. Elijah didn't move right away, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk, his notebook still open to half-finished equations written in careful, precise handwriting, the kind that came from years of working twice as hard just to be seen as equal. The lecture hall felt smaller suddenly, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead pressing down like static, the faint scratch of someone's pen in the back row stopping mid-line, as if even that sound might break the tension. "What's the matter?" Whitmore added, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he adjusted his cufflinks. Polished, deliberate, controlled, too advanced. A couple of quiet chuckles slipped through the room, not loud enough to be called out, but sharp enough to be felt, and Elijah heard them, every single one. The way you hear something even when you pretend you don't, the way it settles somewhere behind your ribs. He stood slowly, the legs of his chair scraping against the floor in a sound that seemed louder than it should have been, and for a brief second, he considered staying silent, letting the moment pass, letting Whitmore move on to someone else. But he had done that before, too many times, and it never changed anything. The walk to the board was only about 20 feet, but it stretched, each step measured, steady, the polished floor reflecting the overhead lights in long pale streaks, his sneakers soft against the surface while the rest of the room stayed still, watching. He could feel it, the weight of expectation, or maybe assumption, the quiet certainty that this was about to go exactly the way it always did. When he reached the board, he didn't reach for the chalk immediately, his eyes scanning the equation. Whitmore had written, symbols layered over symbols in a structure that looked complex enough to intimidate, but familiar enough to recognize patterns, and Elijah's gaze slowed, then sharpened. Something was off, not obvious, not something you'd catch if you were rushing to solve. But there, hidden in the logic, a small shift that changed everything. Behind him, Whitmore exhaled softly, almost bored, as if the outcome had already been decided. "We're waiting, Mr. Brooks," he said, his tone even, measured, carrying just enough edge to make it clear this wasn't a request. Elijah finally picked up the chalk, the fine dust settling lightly against his fingertips, cool and dry, grounding in a way that steadied him. He remembered nights spent at a small desk in his apartment, a single lamp casting a warm circle of light while the rest of the room faded into shadow, pages filled and crossed out, filled again. The quiet discipline of figuring things out when no one was watching, when no one expected anything at all. A whisper drifted from somewhere behind him, barely audible. "He's setting him up." And Elijah didn't turn, didn't react, just let the words pass through him like background noise. The equation in front of him wasn't impossible, not really, but it wasn't right either, and that difference mattered. He lifted the chalk but held it just a fraction of an inch from the board, hovering, his reflection faint in the glossy surface, the room holding its breath in that suspended second. Whitmore took a step closer, hands clasped loosely behind his back, observing, studying, waiting for hesitation to turn into collapse. Elijah's grip tightened slightly, not from fear, but from focus, and when the chalk finally touched the board, it wasn't with a rush to solve, but with intention, precise, controlled, as he began not with the answer, but with the question no one else had thought to ask. The chalk made a soft, almost delicate sound as it touched the board, not rushed, not uncertain, just a single clean stroke that cut through the silence. Elijah did not begin where most would, not at the left side trying to solve forward, but near the center of the equation, circling one term with a slow, deliberate motion, the faint white dust trailing behind his hand. A few students leaned forward, confusion replacing their earlier amusement, because this was not how you approached a problem like this, not if you were trying to keep up, not if you were trying to survive the moment. Professor Whitmore's eyes narrowed slightly, his posture still composed, but less relaxed now, as if something subtle had shifted just beyond his control. "Careful," he said, his voice calm but edged. "You are not here to decorate the board, Mr. Brooks, you are here to solve it." But Elijah did not respond. Not immediately. His focus locked on the structure in front of him, seeing past the symbols into the logic beneath, the place where intention met execution and sometimes failed. He drew a short line beneath the circled term, then wrote a small notation beside it, something precise, almost understated, but enough to change the way the entire expression was read. A pause rippled through the room, quiet but noticeable, like the moment before a shift in weather. In the third row, a student who rarely looked up from his laptop lifted his head, eyes narrowing, scanning the board again, then again, slower this time. Elijah stepped half a pace back, just enough to see the full equation, his hand lowering slightly, chalk still between his fingers, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. Whitmore moved closer now, closing the distance by a few feet, his shoes clicking softly against the floor, his gaze tracing the mark Elijah had made, then returning to the original equation, as if comparing two versions of the same truth. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" he asked, quieter now, the question less for the room and more for Elijah himself. Elijah finally spoke, his voice steady, not raised, not defensive, just clear. "I am reading it, sir." And the simplicity of the answer hung there, heavier than expected. A few students exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. But no one chose either, because something in the tone had changed. Elijah turned back to the board and added another line, not solving forward, but restructuring, shifting the placement of a variable in a way that exposed a hidden imbalance, subtle but undeniable once seen. The chalk moved with quiet precision, each mark intentional, each pause measured, and with every step, the equation began to look less like a challenge and more like a question that had been asked incorrectly. Whitmore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his confidence not gone, but no longer absolute. And for the first time since the moment he had tossed the chalk, he did not interrupt. The room felt different now, not tense in the same way, but suspended, as if everyone understood they were no longer watching a student struggle, but something else entirely, something unfolding in real time that did not fit the script they had expected. Elijah stopped again, the chalk hovering just above the surface, and for a brief second, the only sound was the low hum of the lights and the faint rhythm of breathing across the room. Then, without looking back, he said quietly, "This part does not follow." And the words did not sound like an excuse or hesitation, but like a conclusion he had already reached, one that the rest of the room was only beginning to understand. The words settled into the room and did not move, not like a challenge, not like a guess, but like something final, and for a second no one spoke, not even the students who had been quietly amused just minutes ago. Professor Whitmore stood still, his gaze fixed on the section Elijah had marked, tracing the symbols again, slower this time, his confidence now forced into silence as he recalculated in his head. Elijah did not turn around, did not rush to explain. He simply remained where he was, the chalk resting lightly between his fingers, his posture calm, almost detached, as if the tension in the room no longer belonged to him. Somewhere near the back, a chair shifted softly, the smallest sound, but it echoed in the stillness, because now everyone was looking at the board differently, not searching for an answer, but searching for what had been missed. Whitmore stepped closer, just one pace, then another, his polished shoes barely making a sound, his eyes narrowing as he leaned in, slightly, examining the structure Elijah had exposed, the imbalance that had been hidden beneath layers of complexity. He lifted his hand as if to point, then paused, his fingers hovering in the air before slowly lowering again. The equation, once sharp and imposing, now looked uneven, its logic fractured in a way that could not be ignored once seen. Elijah finally set the chalk down on the ledge, the soft click marking the only movement he made, and then he stepped aside, giving the board back without a word. A student in the front row leaned forward, squinting, then whispered under his breath, "That changes everything." And this time, no one laughed, no one dismissed it, because it was true. Whitmore exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but heavier than before, and for the first time since the moment he had called Elijah forward, he did not look at him as a student to correct, but as someone who had altered the ground beneath him. The room held that shift, quiet but undeniable, as Whitmore reached for the chalk himself, his hand steady but slower now, more deliberate, and he began to trace the equation again from the beginning, checking each step, each assumption, each connection, as if rebuilding something he had once trusted without question. Seconds stretched longer than they should have, the silence thick but no longer oppressive, more like anticipation, like waiting for something to be confirmed. Elijah stood off to the side, his eyes not on the class, not even on Whitmore, but on the board, watching, not with urgency, but with certainty. Then Whitmore stopped, just for a fraction of a second, his hand tightening slightly around the chalk, and though he said nothing, the pause itself said enough. A quiet realization moved through the room, not spoken, but felt, as the authority that had filled the space at the start of the lecture began to shift, not shattered, not broken, but rebalanced in a way no one had expected. Elijah remained still, his voice no longer needed, because the truth he had pointed to was now unfolding on its own, line by line, under the careful, silent revision of the man who had once been so sure. The chalk moved again, but this time it was not confident, not sharp. It slowed, hesitated, each stroke measured as if the board itself had become something fragile, something that could not be forced into place. Professor Whitmore rewrote the line Elijah had marked, adjusting one symbol, then another, his brows tightening as the structure began to shift under his own hand, the logic no longer aligning the way he expected. The room stayed silent, not out of fear, but because everyone felt it now, that quiet unraveling, the moment when certainty starts to slip and there is no easy way to catch it. A student near the aisle leaned closer to his notebook, flipping back a page, comparing what he had written earlier to what was now on the board, his pencil hovering, unsure which version to trust. Whitmore stepped back slightly, just enough to see the equation as a whole, his eyes scanning from left to right, then again, slower, deeper, as if searching for a place to anchor the original idea. But there was none, not anymore. Elijah remained still at the side, his shoulders relaxed, his gaze steady, not demanding attention, not seeking validation, just present, like someone who had already finished the work internally long before stepping to the board. The faint hum of the lights seemed louder now, filling the space between movements, and somewhere a clock ticked softly, marking time that felt stretched, suspended. Whitmore lifted the chalk again, rewriting from the top, this time more carefully, tracing each step as if rebuilding a structure that had quietly collapsed beneath him. And with every correction, the original version faded, no longer something to defend, but something to replace. A quiet realization spread through the class, not spoken, but shared, that this was no longer a test of a student, but a recalibration of the entire room. One student who had smiled earlier now sat completely still, his expression neutral, watching with a kind of focused attention that had not been there before. Whitmore's hand paused again, just for a second, the chalk pressing lightly against the board without moving. And in that stillness, something unspoken settled, not embarrassment, not defeat, but recognition. He finished the revised line and lowered his hand, the chalk leaving a faint trace of dust in the air before resting at his side. For a moment, he did not turn, did not speak, just stood there facing the board he had rewritten, as if confirming what he now understood. Then, slowly, he stepped aside, creating space where there had once been control, and his voice, when it came, was quieter than before, stripped of the edge it once carried. "Continue," he said, not as a command, but as an acknowledgement, and the word changed the air in the room in a way no one could ignore. Elijah stepped forward again, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with the same calm rhythm, picking up the chalk where it had been left, and as he faced the board once more, the equation no longer looked like a trap, but like something honest, something that could finally be completed the right way. And the room leaned into that moment, waiting, not for him to fail, but to see what he would reveal next. Elijah did not rush, the chalk resting lightly between his fingers as if it carried weight beyond its size. And when he began to write again, the motion was steady, deliberate, each line placed with care rather than speed. The equation now felt different, no longer a test designed to expose weakness, but a structure waiting to be completed, and Elijah approached it like something worth understanding, not something to conquer. The soft scrape of chalk against the board filled the room in slow, even strokes, and with each step, The logic unfolded cleanly, naturally, as if it had always been meant to look this way. A student in the second row leaned forward, eyes following every symbol, then quickly flipped a page in his notebook, trying to keep up, his earlier confidence replaced with focus. Whitmore stood just behind and to the side now, not interrupting, not correcting, his arms no longer crossed. His posture subtly shifted, as if he were no longer holding the room in place but observing it as it changed. Elijah paused briefly at a key step, not out of hesitation, but to align the structure, adjusting a variable with a small, precise movement that caused a ripple of recognition across the class. Someone near the back whispered, "That is it." Barely audible, but enough to carry. The equation, once dense and imposing, now resolved into something clear, something balanced, each part supporting the next without strain, and the final steps came not as a dramatic finish, but as a quiet conclusion, the kind that feels inevitable once seen. Elijah wrote the last line and lowered his hand, the chalk leaving a faint trace of dust before he set it gently on the ledge, and for a moment, no one spoke. The silence was not empty. It was full, filled with the weight of what had just happened, the shift that no one could deny. Elijah stepped back, giving the board space, his expression unchanged, calm, composed, as if he had simply done what was necessary. Whitmore looked at the completed solution, his gaze moving slowly across each line, verifying, not out of doubt now, but out of respect for the process, and when he reached the end, he stopped, the stillness returning but in a different form. A student in the front row straightened in his seat. Another lowered her pen, both watching, waiting for what would come next. Whitmore reached out and picked up the chalk again. But this time, he did not rewrite, did not correct. He simply held it for a moment before placing it back down. A small action, almost invisible, but it carried meaning. He turned slightly, not fully facing Elijah, not fully facing the class, but somewhere in between, and the room felt that balance, that quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted beyond a single equation. Elijah did not speak, did not seek recognition. He simply stood there for a second longer, then began to step away from the board, returning to his seat with the same steady pace he had walked up with. But the room he walked through was not the same one he had crossed minutes before, because now, every eye followed him not with expectation, but with understanding. And the board behind him, filled with clean, precise lines, stood as proof of something deeper than correctness, something that could not be erased as easily as chalk. Elijah's chair made a softer sound this time as he sat down, the faint scrape barely noticeable against the lingering silence, and for a moment, no one moved. Not even the students who usually rushed to fill the quiet with shifting papers or tapping keys. The equation still stood on the board, clean and complete, the white lines sharp against the dark surface, holding the room in a way no voice could. Professor Whitmore remained near the front, his gaze fixed on the solution, not scanning now, not verifying, but absorbing, as if committing it to memory in a different way than before. His posture had changed, subtly but clearly. The rigid certainty that once defined him softened into something more measured, more aware. A student near the window slowly closed his laptop, the click of it echoing lightly, and another straightened in her seat, her pen hovering above her notebook but not writing, because the moment did not feel like something to capture. It felt like something to understand. Whitmore finally turned, not sharply, not with authority, but with intention, his eyes moving across the class, pausing briefly, then continuing, as if recalibrating how he saw each person in the room. When his gaze reached Elijah, it did not stop in the same way it had earlier. It did not carry the weight of expectation or doubt. It held something quieter, something that did not need to be named. "There is a difference," he said slowly, his voice lower now, less performative, more deliberate, "between solving a problem and understanding it." And the words settled into the space without resistance. "No." One responded, but the room listened, truly listened, in a way it had not before. Whitmore took a few steps toward the board again, his hand brushing lightly against the ledge where the chalk rested, not picking it up this time, just acknowledging its presence, as if the act of writing no longer belonged solely to him. "Most people," he continued, "move forward because they are told to move forward." His eyes briefly flicking toward the equation, then back to the class. But sometimes the real work is knowing when to stop and question what is already there. Elijah sat still, his hands resting lightly on his desk, his notebook open but untouched, the faint lines of earlier notes visible but no longer relevant in the same way. A quiet shift passed through the students, not dramatic, not spoken, but real, the kind that changes how a room feels without anyone announcing it. Whitmore stepped back again, giving space not just to the board, but to the moment itself, and for the first time, he did not rush to continue the lecture, did not fill the silence with more information, he allowed it to exist. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking seconds that felt more significant than they should, and the fluorescent lights above continued their steady hum, unchanged, even as everything beneath them had shifted. Elijah glanced once at the board, then back down at his desk, not with relief, not with pride, but with a quiet steadiness, as if this moment was not an end, but part of something ongoing, something larger than a single class, a single equation. And as the room slowly began to move again, papers adjusting, pens lifting, breaths releasing, the change remained, subtle but permanent, written not just on the board, but in the way the space itself now held everyone inside it. The room did not return to normal, not right away. Even as notebooks reopened and pens began to move again, there was a hesitation in the rhythm, a subtle awareness that something had shifted beneath the surface of what had once felt routine. Professor Whitmore moved back to his desk, but not with the same sharp precision as before, his steps quieter, more measured, as if he were adjusting to a space that no longer responded the way it used to. He picked up a stack of papers, glanced at them, then set them down again without speaking, the action incomplete, almost absent-minded, as though his focus had not fully returned. Elijah sat still, his eyes on his notebook now, but he did not write immediately, his hand resting lightly on the page, the faint outline of earlier notes still visible, but no longer holding the same weight. A student across the aisle looked over at him, just for a second, then quickly looked away, not out of dismissal, but out of something closer to respect, something quieter. The air carried a different kind of silence now, not heavy, not tense, but reflective, like a pause that meant something even without words. Whitmore finally spoke again, but his voice had changed, not in volume, but in tone, less performative, less certain. "Let us continue," he said, but even the phrase sounded different, less like instruction and more like invitation. He turned toward the board again, but instead of writing immediately, he studied the space Elijah had just worked through, the clean lines still visible, the corrected logic still present, and for a brief moment, he did nothing at all. Then he picked up the chalk, but instead of erasing, he added a small note beneath the final line, a clarification, not a correction, something that aligned with what was already there rather than replacing it. A student in the front row blinked, noticing the difference, the absence of authority in the gesture, replaced by something more collaborative, more precise. Elijah finally lowered his gaze and began to write again in his notebook, his pen moving steadily now, capturing not just the solution, but the structure behind it, the reasoning that had led there, his movements calm, unaffected by the attention that still lingered around him. A quiet exchange passed between two students behind him, a whisper that did not carry words clearly, but carried tone, and that tone had shifted from amusement to curiosity. Whitmore stepped back once more, placing the chalk down carefully, almost deliberately, as if the act itself required intention now. He glanced toward Elijah again, briefly, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to acknowledge something that had not been there before. The clock on the wall marked another minute, the sound steady, grounding, as the class slowly settled into a new rhythm, one that felt less like performance and more like understanding. And though no one said it out loud, the room had changed in a way that would not easily reverse. A quiet recalibration of what mattered, not just in the equation on the board, but in the space between the people standing and sitting within it, where something unspoken had been corrected just as precisely as the line of logic that had started it all. The class moved forward, but the movement felt different now, quieter, more intentional, as if each student was aware that something subtle but permanent had shifted in the room. Elijah's pen traced steady lines across his notebook, not hurried, not trying to catch up, but reinforcing what he already understood, the structure now clear in his mind in a way that did not rely on memorization. Across the room, a student who had not spoken all semester raised her hand halfway, then hesitated, then lowered it again, as if reconsidering what it meant to ask a question in a space that no longer felt predictable. Professor Whitmore stood near the board, his attention moving between the equation and the class, but not in the same controlling pattern as before, his gaze softer, more observant, as if he were listening rather than directing. He picked up the chalk again, but this time his movements were slower, deliberate, adding a small extension to the solution, a variation that built on what Elijah had completed, rather than replacing it. And when he finished, he stepped back immediately, leaving the work visible without framing it with commentary. The room responded in silence, but it was not empty. It carried thought, recognition, and a quiet recalibration of expectations. Elijah glanced up briefly, his eyes following the added step, then returned to his notebook, adjusting his notes with a small correction, his pen moving with the same calm precision as before. A student behind him leaned slightly to the side, trying to see his page, not out of suspicion now, but curiosity, as if understanding might be shared rather than guarded. The clock ticked again, steady, grounding, marking time that no longer felt routine. Whitmore rested his hand lightly against the edge of the desk, his fingers tapping once, then stopping, as if even that small habit had lost its place. "Consider," he said quietly, not raising his voice, "what changes when the assumption changes." And the statement did not feel like a lecture. It felt like an open space, something to step into rather than something to follow. No one responded immediately, but the effect was visible, heads tilted slightly, eyes returning to the board, to their notes, to the structure itself. Elijah paused for a moment, his pen hovering, then added a single line beneath his work, a brief notation that connected the idea Whitmore had just introduced to the solution already completed, not rewriting, not challenging, just extending. The room absorbed that small addition, the way it fit seamlessly, the way it did not compete for attention but still shifted the understanding forward. Whitmore noticed it, not with surprise, but with a quiet acknowledgement, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second before moving on. The lecture continued, but it no longer felt like something imposed. It unfolded, piece by piece, shaped by attention rather than authority. And in that unfolding, the earlier moment remained, not as a disruption, but as a foundation, something that had reset the tone of the room in a way that could not be undone. Even as the class moved forward into the next problem, the next idea, carrying with it a new understanding of what it meant to truly see what was written in front of them. The next problem appeared on the board without announcement, written in the same steady hand, but it did not carry the same weight as before, not because it was easier, but because the room itself had changed. Professor Whitmore stepped aside after writing it, leaving more space than usual, his presence no longer pressing against the front of the class, but settling into the background, observant, measured. The symbols stretched across the board in a clean line, complex enough to demand attention. But this time, no one looked at Elijah to see if he would be called again. They looked at the problem itself. A student in the second row raised his hand, then spoke before being acknowledged, his voice careful. "Should we check the assumptions first?" And the question lingered, not challenged, not dismissed, just considered. Whitmore nodded once, a small motion, but one that carried weight. "That would be a reasonable place to begin," he replied, and the tone was different, not instructive, but affirming. Pens began to move again, but slower, more deliberate, as if each student was now aware that the first step mattered more than the final answer. Elijah listened, his eyes on the board, not withdrawn, not separate, but part of the room in a way that felt more visible without being forced. He wrote a few lines in his notebook, then paused, his pen hovering, not because he did not know what to do, but because he was choosing how to approach it. Behind him, the same student who had leaned earlier now whispered softly to a classmate, "Look at the structure first." And the words echoed something that had not been spoken directly, but had been learned. Whitmore moved slightly, his hand resting on the edge of the desk again. But this time the gesture was not habitual, it was grounded, as if he were anchoring himself in the shift that had taken place. "Walk me through it," he said, not to Elijah, but to the room, and a different student stood, hesitating for only a second before stepping forward. Her steps were careful, but not fearful, and when she reached the board, she did not rush. She looked, just as Elijah had, taking in the full equation before touching the chalk. The room watched, not with the expectation of failure, but with attention, the kind that allows space for understanding. She circled a term, smaller than Elijah's earlier mark, but intentional, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. If this part shifts, everything after it changes, and no one interrupted her. Whitmore did not step in, did not correct. He simply listened, his gaze following her reasoning as it unfolded. Elijah leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes steady, not evaluating, not judging, just present. As the process continued, the class had found a different rhythm now, one that did not rely on performance, but on clarity, and the board reflected it, line by line. As the new solution began to take shape, the earlier moment remained, not as a memory, but as a standard, something that quietly guided every step that followed. And as the chalk moved across the board once more, it no longer sounded like pressure, it sounded like possibility. The student at the board continued, her chalk moving in careful strokes, each line placed with intention, and for a moment it seemed like the class had fully shifted into this new rhythm, one built on patience and understanding. Then she paused, just slightly, her hand hovering midair, and the room felt it immediately, that small break in flow, that hesitation that did not come from fear, but from uncertainty. She stepped back half a pace, eyes scanning the equation again, her brow tightening as she traced the logic she had just written. "Wait," she said softly, not to the professor, but to herself, and the word carried just enough to ripple through the room. Professor Whitmore did not interrupt, but his posture changed, his shoulders straightening slightly as he stepped closer, not to take over, but to see. The board now held a partial solution, clean but incomplete, and something within it did not align, not in the same obvious way as before, but subtly, buried deeper. A student near the back shifted in his seat, glancing at his own notes, then back at the board, trying to locate the disconnect. Elijah's eyes lifted from his notebook again, not sharply, not urgently, but with quiet attention, his gaze settling on the section where the student had paused. The room held that moment, stretched thin, waiting for someone to see what was not yet clear. Whitmore folded his hands loosely, his voice low when he spoke. "Take your time." And the words did not carry pressure, they offered space. The student nodded slightly, her grip on the chalk tightening just enough to leave a faint trace on the board, but she did not write. She only looked. Seconds passed, longer than they should have, and the silence returned, not uncomfortable, but focused, as if everyone in the room had leaned into the same question at once. Elijah shifted slightly in his seat, his pen lowering to the desk, his eyes narrowing just a fraction as he traced the logic step by step, not rushing, not assuming, just observing. Then he noticed it, not as a mistake in calculation, but as something more fundamental, a condition that had been carried forward without being fully examined. He did not speak immediately, did not raise his hand. He simply watched, giving the moment a chance to resolve on its own. At the board, the student exhaled softly, her shoulders lowering. As she turned halfway toward the class, uncertainty now visible in her expression. "I think I missed something," she said, her voice steady but quieter than before. No one reacted, not with laughter, not with judgment. The room held her words with the same respect it had learned just minutes earlier. Whitmore stepped one pace closer, his eyes scanning the line again, and for a brief second, there was a flicker of something familiar, the old instinct to correct, to step in and guide, but it passed, replaced by restraint. Elijah finally leaned forward slightly, his voice calm when it came, not loud, not interrupting, but clear enough to carry. "It is not the step," he said, his eyes still on the board. "It is what the step assumes." And the words settled into the space, precise, measured. The student turned back to the board, following his gaze, and as she did, the shift began again, subtle but undeniable, the kind that starts with one realization and expands outward. Whitmore did not speak, but his attention sharpened, his focus drawn to the exact place Elijah had indicated, and the room followed, every eye returning to the board, not to see who was right, but to understand what had been overlooked. The words did not land loudly, but they settled with precision, and the room shifted toward them almost instinctively. The student at the board turned back fully now, her eyes narrowing slightly as she traced the exact portion Elijah had indicated, her hand lifting the chalk, but not writing yet, just following the line of logic with a careful, deliberate focus. The assumption, she repeated quietly, not as a question, but as something she was beginning to see, and as she looked closer, the structure began to change, not visibly at first, but in the way it connected, or failed to. She circled a small part of the expression, a detail easy to overlook if the goal had been speed rather than clarity, and the faint white ring seemed almost insignificant, yet it held the entire progression in place. A student near the aisle leaned forward again, his eyes widening slightly as the implication settled in. "If that does not hold," he murmured under his breath, "then none of this does." And the realization moved quietly through the room. Professor Whitmore stepped closer, his presence still measured, but his attention sharpened fully now, his gaze fixed on the exact point of tension within the equation, not stepping in, not correcting, but observing with a kind of restraint that had not been there before. The student at the board took a slow breath, then erased just a small section, the chalk brushing lightly across the surface, removing not the entire solution, but the piece that had carried the faulty assumption forward. The sound was soft, controlled, and the absence it left behind felt larger than the mark itself. Elijah watched without speaking, his posture steady, his eyes following the correction as it unfolded, not guiding, not directing, just allowing the process to happen in its own time. The student rewrote the line, adjusting the condition, her movements more confident now, not because she had all the answers, but because she had found the right question. The equation began to realign, each step now supported by something solid, something examined rather than assumed, and as she moved forward, the structure held, clean and consistent. The room followed closely, not with pressure, but with attention, every symbol carrying weight, every transition understood rather than accepted. Whitmore's expression softened slightly, not in approval alone, but in recognition, as if he were witnessing not just a correction, but a shift in how the work itself was being approached. When the student reached the final line, she paused, not out of uncertainty this time, but to confirm, her eyes moving across the entire board once more before lowering the chalk to the ledge with a quiet, final click. No one spoke immediately, but the silence felt complete, not waiting for validation, but holding its own. Whitmore nodded once, a small motion, but one that carried meaning beyond the gesture, and for a brief moment, his gaze moved toward Elijah. Not as a challenge, not as a test, but as an acknowledgement that did not need to be spoken aloud. Elijah gave the smallest nod in return, almost imperceptible, then looked back down at his notebook, his pen moving again, steady, precise, as the room settled into this new understanding, where the work was no longer about proving someone wrong, but about seeing what was right. The room did not erupt. It did not break into applause or sudden movement. Instead, it settled into something quieter, something heavier with meaning, as if everyone understood that what had just happened could not be reduced to a reaction. The student stepped away from the board, her shoulders lowering slightly, not in relief alone, but in a quiet confidence that had not been there when she first stood up, and she returned to her seat without looking around, as if the work itself had been enough. Professor Whitmore remained where he was for a moment, his eyes still on the completed solution, not scanning now, not verifying, but reflecting, as though he were seeing more than the equation, seeing the process that had unfolded in front of him and what it revealed beyond the symbols. He reached for the chalk again, but instead of writing, he turned it slowly between his fingers, the fine dust catching the light, a small detail that seemed to anchor the stillness. Then, without announcement, he stepped forward and erased a single word near the top of the board, not part of the solution, but part of the original framing, the assumption that had guided the problem from the beginning. The motion was deliberate, controlled, and when the chalk brushed across it, the removal felt larger than the space it cleared. He did not replace it immediately. He left the space open, visible, as if acknowledging what had been there and what no longer belonged. The class watched, not with confusion, but with understanding, the kind that does not need explanation. Elijah's pen slowed, then stopped, his eyes lifting once more to the board, following the erasure, the empty space, and the quiet intention behind it. Whitmore finally spoke, his voice steady but different, stripped of the distance it once carried. Sometimes, he said, pausing just long enough for the room to hold the word. The hardest part is not solving what is written, but recognizing what should not have been written at all, and the sentence did not feel like a lesson. It felt like an admission. No one moved, no one spoke, because the weight of it was enough. Whitmore placed the chalk down carefully, not with finality, but with care, and stepped back, giving the board and the space back to the room. Elijah lowered his gaze again, but there was no tension in the movement, no need to retreat, only a quiet steadiness, as if the moment had settled into him without resistance. A student near the window shifted slightly, her notebook open but untouched, her eyes still on the board, as if trying to hold onto the clarity before it faded into routine. The clock ticked again, marking time that now felt different, not because it had slowed, but because it had been filled with something that would remain. And in that quiet, the room understood, not through instruction, but through experience, that what had changed was not just the equation, but the way they would look at every one that came after it. The bell did not ring immediately, and no one rushed to pack their bags. The usual end-of-class shuffle replaced by a quiet stillness that lingered a few seconds longer than expected. The board remained filled, not crowded, but clear, each line carrying the weight of how it had been built, how it had been questioned, and how it had been corrected. Professor Whitmore stood near the edge of the desk, his hands resting lightly against the surface. Not gripping, not directing, just present, his gaze moving once more across the room, slower now, more deliberate, as if he were seeing each student individually rather than as a group. When his eyes passed over Elijah, they did not pause out of scrutiny. They acknowledged, briefly, then moved on, equal, balanced, and that small difference settled into the space without needing to be named. Elijah closed his notebook quietly, the soft sound of the cover folding over the pages marking a kind of completion, not of the lesson, but of something less visible, something that had shifted inside the room and inside him at the same time. A student near the front finally exhaled audibly, a breath she had not realized she had been holding, and the sound seemed to release the rest of the class as well. Chairs shifting slightly, notebooks closing, but still without the usual noise, as if everyone understood that speaking too loudly might break something that needed to remain intact. Whitmore picked up the chalk one last time, turning it once between his fingers, then placing it back down exactly where it had been, aligned, intentional, and he did not write another word. "That will be all for today," he said, his voice calm, steady, but quieter than at the beginning, and the sentence did not feel like dismissal. It felt like closure. Students began to stand, slowly, gathering their things, but many glanced once more at the board before leaving, as if trying to carry the clarity with them beyond the room. Elijah remained seated for a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but out of stillness, his eyes lifting briefly to the space where the original assumption had been erased, the faint trace still visible under the light, then lowering again, when he finally stood. He did so without urgency, his movements measured, his bag slung over his shoulder with the same quiet ease he had carried all along. As he stepped into the aisle, a student who had once looked past him now shifted slightly to give him space, a small gesture, but one that held meaning in its simplicity. Whitmore remained at the front, watching the class filter out, his posture unchanged, but his presence different. No longer something that pressed down, but something that held space. The room slowly emptied, the hum of the lights returning to the foreground, steady, unchanged, even as everything beneath them had been altered. Elijah reached the doorway and paused for just a fraction of a second, not turning back, not seeking acknowledgement, just standing in that threshold where one space ended and another began. Then he stepped out into the hallway, the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. Inside the classroom, the board remained, the corrected lines, the erased assumption, the quiet evidence of what had taken place. And for a moment longer, Whitmore stood there alone, looking at it, not as a problem solved, but as something understood before he reached for the eraser and slowly began to clear the surface, line by line, not removing what had happened, but letting it settle into memory, where it would remain long after the chalk was gone.